The calls stopped suddenly, and that's how I knew something was wrong. My mother never skipped a day. Never. Even when I was deployed, even when the connection was bad, even when there was nothing to say. She called in the evenings, always around the same time. 5 minutes, sometimes less. Enough to confirm that I was still alive and that she was still useful as a mother. Did you eat? Are you warm? Don't forget your scarf. I answered on autopilot. I always did. On base, you learn to compress emotions. There's no space for them. Time behaves strangely there. Days smear into each other, nights disappear completely, and you stop noticing absences unless they're loud. This one was quiet. The first evening passed without a call. I blamed it on myself. Training ran late. Phones were restricted. I told myself she probably assumed I'd call later. I didn't. The second day was worse. I caught myself checking my phone during inspection, then felt stupid for it. People don't vanish in 48 hours. Mothers, especially. Still, something felt misaligned, like a picture hanging slightly crooked on the wall. Not enough to panic, enough to bother you. On the third day, she called. Her voice wasn't shaky. That scared me more than if it had been. She spoke slowly, clearly, choosing words like someone filing paperwork instead of reporting danger. "They come in the evenings," she said. I remember sitting down without realizing it. My legs just folded. The room smelled like detergent and metal. Someone was laughing down the corridor. Life was continuing normally everywhere except where it mattered. "Who comes?" I asked. "Men," she replied. "They don't introduce themselves." I waited for her to add something, names, threats, shouting. She didn't. "They say the house belongs to them now," she continued, almost casually. "That there's been a change. They speak with confidence." That word landed heavily. Confidence. Not anger, not desperation. Confidence is worse. Confidence means rehearsal. It means they've already practiced this conversation in their heads and decided how it ends. I asked where they stood. "At first, by the gate," she said. "Later, inside the yard. They don't come into the house. They don't need to." She told me they never raised their voices, never touched her, never broke anything. Just repeated the same phrase evening after evening as if saying it often enough would make it true. "You'll have to move out soon." I asked if she had called the police. She paused. "They aren't doing anything illegal," she said. "Not yet." That sentence stayed with me. Not yet. My mother has a way of understanding danger before it becomes official. She grew up learning how close the line can be before it snaps. I asked why she hadn't told me sooner. "I didn't want to distract you," she answered quickly. Too quickly. "You're serving. You have responsibilities. I thought it would resolve itself." That was the moment my chest tightened. My mother only minimizes her own fear when it's already bigger than she can manage. She'd rather carry it alone than feel like a burden. I looked down at my uniform. Clean, pressed, neutral. On base, it means protection. Outside of it, people think it means distance, absence, ignorance. Somewhere far away, men had decided that a lone woman in an old house was an opportunity. That paperwork and pressure could replace ownership. That silence meant consent. They assumed I wouldn't know. They assumed I wouldn't act. They assumed I was just a girl in service, far away, busy, harmless. They were wrong. And I hadn't even made the call yet. The house had always been ours, but not in the way people usually mean when they say that. It wasn't registered under my mother's name. Not under my father's either. Years ago, my grandfather had put it in my name. Back then, it felt like one of his strange old man decisions, half practical, half symbolic. He said paperwork should be done before it becomes urgent. I was young, barely an adult, and I signed where he told me to sign without really understanding what it meant. At the time, it felt abstract, a formality, something that existed only on paper. Now it had weight. My mother lived there alone. The house wasn't big, wasn't special. A small yard, a narrow gate, neighbors who minded their own business. The kind of place people forget about unless they're looking for something easy. Elderly couples. A retired man who smoked every morning in the same spot. A woman who watered her flowers like it was a sacred ritual. Ordinary places feel safest right before they don't. After the call, my mother started talking more. Not emotionally, factually. Like she was giving a report instead of asking for help. They come around 7, she said. Always 2 of them, sometimes 3. What do they look like? I asked. She thought for a moment. Normal, jackets, clean shoes, not local. That detail mattered. Locals don't need to assert ownership. Outsiders do. She told me they never knocked. Just opened the gate and stood there as if they'd always belonged. Sometimes they leaned on the fence. Once, one of them sat on the old bench my grandfather had built himself. That made my jaw clench. Sitting is familiarity. Sitting means they were already rehearsing permanence. They say things like, "You should start packing," my mother continued. Or, "We don't want trouble," as if I was the one causing it. I asked her how she reacted. "I listened," she said. "I didn't argue. I didn't invite them in. I just listened." That was smart. You don't escalate when you don't know who you're dealing with. Still, it made my stomach turn to imagine her standing there alone, nodding politely while strangers measured her life in square meters. She admitted something then, quietly. "I stopped turning the lights off at night," she said. "I leave them on now. All of them." Fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like electricity bills. I asked if the neighbors had noticed. "They did," she replied. One of them asked if we were selling. I said no. The word we caught in my throat. Even alone, she still said we. She told me the men had documents once, copies, not originals. They waved them from a distance, never close enough for her to read. They spoke about companies, transfers, mistakes in registries. Big words that sound official enough to scare people who don't deal with paperwork every day. "They said the owner had changed," she said, "that the records would update soon." I almost laughed at that. Almost. Records don't update soon unless someone pushes them. I asked her again if she felt in danger. She paused longer this time. "No," she said, "but I feel displaced, like they've already decided I'm temporary." That sentence hit harder than any threat. Violence announces itself. Erasure is quieter. After the call, I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. The bass hummed around me, voices, boots, distant metal sounds. Everyone here belonged somewhere by definition. Rank, unit, order. My mother was being slowly written out of her own house by people who assumed no one would contest it. They were counting on distance, on my absence, on the idea that paperwork beats presence and that confidence beats truth. They didn't know that the house wasn't just occupied by my family. It was protected. They just hadn't realized by whom yet. I was on base, and that meant I couldn't just leave. People who haven't served think uniform equals freedom, authority, options. In reality, it often means the opposite. Schedules are locked. Permissions stack on permissions. You don't decide when your personal life gets urgent enough to matter. Someone else does. We were in exercises, restricted status, phones allowed only in short windows, monitored, predictable. The kind of environment where the outside world feels theoretical, like something you once belonged to but don't anymore. And yet, it had found me. After my call with my mother, I stood in the hallway longer than necessary, pretending to reread a notice on the wall. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Inside, everything was sharp and alert, but outwardly, I was calm. That calm had been trained into me. You don't panic on base. Panic wastes energy. I knew one thing immediately. I wasn't calling them. Men who show up in the evenings at a lone woman's house aren't interested in explanations. They want compliance. They want fear to do the work for them. Calling them directly would only confirm what they already assumed, that I was far away, reactive, and easy to intimidate. Instead, I called someone else, not a friend, not a relative, someone whose job was to care about territory, order, and inconvenient details. Someone who didn't ask why before asking where. I waited until my allotted window, stepped outside where the signal was cleaner, and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang once, twice. "Speak," the voice on the other end said. I gave only the address. There was a pause, not long, but intentional. "And the owner?" the voice asked. I gave my last name. The silence after that was different, heavier, the kind that means someone is recalculating. "Understood," the voice finally said. "Stay where you are. No promises, no reassurance, just clarity." I ended the call and stood there for a moment, phone still in my hand. Around me, life continued as if nothing had changed. Someone complained about the food. Someone else argued about a schedule. Boots hit concrete in steady rhythm. I went back inside and finished the day exactly as ordered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind wouldn't stop working. I replayed my mother's words, the men, the confidence, the way they spoke as if ownership was just a matter of patience. I thought about the documents they waved from a distance, copies, never originals. That detail bothered me. Real owners don't hesitate. They don't circle. They don't need to visit in the evenings like ghosts testing boundaries. They act during the day, with stamps and signatures and official language that doesn't need repetition. These men weren't acting like owners. They were acting like pressure. The next morning, during briefing, I felt my phone vibrate once against my leg. Not a call, a message, unknown number, check your secure email. I didn't react. Training teaches you to separate internal response from external behavior. I nodded when required, wrote when required, spoke when addressed. Only when I was alone did I open the message. Attached were scanned documents, company names I didn't recognize, a claim of transfer, dates that didn't line up, signatures that were eager, too round, too similar, like someone imitating authority instead of possessing it. Someone had tried to move fast, hoping no one would slow them down. They counted on a simple equation: lone woman plus distance equals silence. They hadn't factored in that silence on base doesn't mean inaction. It means preparation. I closed the files and deleted the message, not because it wasn't important, but because it already was. Evidence doesn't need to be carried around. That evening, my mother didn't call. I didn't call her either. For the first time since this started, the silence didn't feel threatening. It felt intentional. And somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, people who had been very confident were about to learn that confidence, without permission, is a liability. The papers arrived the next morning. Not dramatically. No envelope slid under a door. No knock. Just a secure message waiting when I logged in, as if it had always been there and I was only late to notice it. That, somehow, made it worse. Quiet things always do. I opened the files slowly, one by one. At first glance, everything looked almost legitimate. Almost. Company names that sounded intentionally boring. Legal language copied well enough to fool someone skimming out of fear. Paragraphs stuffed with references to registries, transfers, adjustments. Words designed to exhaust you before you reach the end. But the longer I looked, the more the cracks showed. The dates didn't align. One document referenced a registry update that supposedly happened before the company even existed. Another listed a representative whose name changed spelling halfway through. Signatures were there, but they were too neat, too consistent, like someone had practiced them on a separate sheet first. These weren't documents meant to survive scrutiny. They were meant to intimidate. That realization cooled something inside me. Fear relies on urgency, on the idea that you don't have time to think, to check, to breathe. These men weren't counting on courts. They were counting on exhaustion, on a woman alone, hearing the same sentence repeated often enough to start believing it. The house is no longer yours. You should start packing. This will be easier if you cooperate. Pressure doesn't need to be violent to be effective. It just needs to be persistent. I thought about my mother standing there, nodding politely, listening, about her leaving the lights on at night, about the way she'd said we even when she was alone. And something sharp passed through me. Not rage, not yet, but focus. They had chosen the wrong timeline. If they'd filed properly, gone through court, sent notices during the day, involved officials, I would have been slowed down by procedure, by distance, by the limits of my position. Instead, they rushed. They tried to scare first and legalize later. That's how you spot amateurs. Later that day, another message came through. Shorter this time. Activity noted in the district. Visitors identified. No further action required from you at this stage. No names, no explanations. Just confirmation that the problem had been acknowledged by people who didn't need convincing. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the wall. Around me, others were talking about weekend leave, about rumors, about nothing that mattered. I envied them for exactly 30 seconds. Then the envy passed. That evening, my mother called. "They didn't come today," she said. Her voice was cautious, like she didn't trust the silence yet. "Did anyone else?" I asked. "No," she replied. But something felt different. I knew what she meant. Pressure has a texture. When it's gone, you can feel the absence like a bruise that stopped hurting but hasn't healed. She told me one of the neighbors had mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars earlier that day. Parked, briefly, then gone. No one knocked. No one entered the yard. Observation without contact. Good. Before hanging up, she hesitated. "I didn't tell them anything about you," she said suddenly. "I mean, if that matters." I closed my eyes. "It matters," I replied. "And you did exactly right." After the call, I sat there longer than necessary, thinking about how confident those men had been, how they spoke as if ownership was just a matter of volume and repetition. They hadn't known who they were dealing with, but more importantly, they hadn't bothered to check. They saw a quiet house, an older woman, no visible resistance. They assumed I was irrelevant. That assumption was already unraveling, because papers tell stories, but so do patterns. And someone, somewhere, had started asking questions. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough to make confident men reconsider their evening routines. I didn't feel victorious yet. It was too early for that. But for the first time since the calls stopped, I felt aligned with time again. Not chasing events, not reacting, waiting. And knowing that waiting, in this case, was not weakness. It was pressure in the opposite direction. I arrived 3 days later, not during the day, not in uniform, not announced. Night arrivals tell you more about a place than daylight ever will. Streets confess things after dark. Houses reveal what they're afraid of. The train stopped with a tired metallic sigh. I stepped onto the platform with a small bag and no insignia, blending into the background the way I'd learned to when I needed to. No one looked at me twice. That was intentional. On the way to the house, I walked the last 2 blocks instead of taking a taxi. I wanted to see the street the way my mother saw it every evening. Same lamps, same shadows, same silence that stretches a second too long when you're waiting for footsteps. The gate was closed. That shouldn't have mattered, but it did. When someone's been trespassing confidently, gates stop being symbolic. They become statements. The yard was quiet. No fresh tire marks, no cigarette butts, no voices drifting from behind fences. Just the soft crunch of gravel under my boots and the faint smell of cold earth. I stood there for a moment before knocking. The door opened almost immediately. My mother didn't say anything. She just pulled me inside and held on like she was afraid I'd disappear if she loosened her grip. This wasn't a greeting hug. It was inventory, counting ribs, checking weight, confirming reality. "They left yesterday," she said into my shoulder. "Left how?" I asked. She stepped back, still holding my arms, studying my face like she was looking for damage. "Quietly," she replied. "No goodbyes, no explanations." The house felt different, not violated, not damaged, just alert, like it had been listening too closely for too long and hadn't yet relaxed. Lights were on in every room, even though it was late. Curtains drawn, but not tightly. The kettle was still warm. "They came earlier than usual," she continued. "Middle of the day, not all of them, just one." My jaw tightened. "He said there had been a mistake," she went on, "that the papers weren't correct. He apologized. Apologies from people like that are never about regret. They're about retreat." "He asked questions?" I asked. "No," she said. "That's what frightened me. He already knew the answers." She told me he hadn't stepped inside the yard, hadn't leaned on the fence, just stood there, hands visible, voice suddenly respectful. He said the situation had been reviewed, that there would be no further visits, that she could live without concern. I poured us both tea, even though neither of us touched it. Familiar motions calm the body before the mind catches up. "Did he mention my name?" I asked. She shook her head. "No," she said. "But he said there was confusion about the owner, emphasis on was." That word mattered. Later, lying in my old room, I listened to the house settle around me, pipes ticking, wood adjusting. Normal sounds reclaiming space. But sleep didn't come easily. My brain kept replaying scenarios. What if I'd been delayed? What if I'd hesitated? What if I'd tried to handle this politely? Fear doesn't need much time to root itself. Just enough repetition. In the morning, I walked the perimeter. Slow, observant, old habit. The gate showed no signs of tampering. The bench was empty, the fence intact. Nothing obvious, but the absence itself told a story. Someone had decided to stop. At noon, there was a knock. Not at the door, at the gate. I opened it myself. A man stood there, mid-40s, neutral coat, posture carefully non-threatening. He smiled the way people do when they want to be remembered as polite. "Good afternoon," he said. "I was looking for your mother." "You found me instead," I replied calmly. His eyes flicked over me, assessing, recalibrating. He didn't ask who I was. He already knew. "There was a misunderstanding," he began. "There usually is," I said. He swallowed. "We just wanted to confirm everything is resolved." "It is," I answered. Silence stretched. He nodded once, like someone accepting a verdict they'd already been given elsewhere. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "Inconvenience?" I repeated softly. He left, without waiting for a response. That was the moment I knew it was over. Not because of the apology, but because he hadn't tried to explain. People who still have leverage explain. People who don't withdraw. When I closed the gate, my hands were steady. 3 days earlier, men had stood here like owners. Now, they wouldn't even step inside. The house exhaled. And for the first time since the calls stopped, so did I. The neighbor spoke to me the next morning. He was exactly where he always was, by the corner of the building, leaning slightly forward, cigarette balanced between two fingers like it had grown there over the years. Same jacket, same cap, same routine. Ordinary people are the best witnesses because they don't try to be. He nodded when he saw me, eyes lingering just a second longer than politeness required. "You're back," he said. "Yes," I replied. He took a drag, exhaled slowly, and glanced toward the gate like he was checking whether it was still allowed to talk. "Strange situation," he said finally. I waited. Silence makes people honest. They were very confident at first, he continued. Walked like they owned the place. Didn't greet anyone. Didn't explain anything. I nodded once. Encouragement without interruption. But yesterday? He shook his head. Different story. Very different. How so? I asked. He leaned closer, lowering his voice even though no one was around. They left as soon as they found out whose daughter you are. There it was. Not who you are. Whose. I felt something cold and controlled move through me, not pride, not anger. Recognition. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about hierarchy. And whose is that? I asked evenly. He looked at me for a long second, measuring what he was allowed to say. They didn't say names, he replied. Didn't need to. Just changed. Like someone had corrected them. He flicked ash onto the ground and added, almost casually, one of them even apologized to your mother. Can you imagine? I could. Perfectly. Apologies like that aren't personal. They're procedural. The neighbor told me more then. Things my mother hadn't noticed or hadn't wanted to repeat. How the men had stopped coming in the evenings after a certain phone call. How one car had returned briefly, parked down the street instead of by the gate. How the men stayed inside it, windows up, engine running, watching, not acting, waiting for confirmation. They weren't angry, he said. They were careful. That word again. First confident, now careful. It was a beautiful progression. I thanked him and walked back inside, my thoughts aligning into something solid. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was the moment when an unspoken line had been revealed. People like those men operate on assumptions. They choose targets based on silence, isolation, and predictability. They don't check deeply because deep checks cost time, and time reduces profit. They had assumed the house was unprotected because protection wasn't visible. They assumed my absence meant weakness. They assumed my mother's calm meant submission. What they hadn't assumed was that silence could be active, that distance could be deceptive, that a name, quietly spoken to the right person, could rearrange their entire plan without a single raised voice. I found my mother in the kitchen, wiping a perfectly clean counter. Her movements were calmer than before, but still slightly too precise, like she didn't fully trust the calm yet. The neighbor talked, she said, without looking up. Yes, I replied. She hesitated, then asked the question she'd been holding since the men left. Did you do something? I met her eyes. I made one call, I said. She exhaled slowly like she'd been holding her breath for days without realizing it. I didn't want trouble, she said quietly. I know, I replied. That's why it stopped. She nodded, accepting that explanation without asking for details. Some families don't need everything spelled out. They recognize outcomes. Later that afternoon, I walked the street alone. Same houses, same fences, same unremarkable quiet. But now I could see how thin the illusion of safety really was, and how quickly it could be restored when the right pressure was applied. No one followed me. No cars slowed. No men stood by gates. The attempt had ended not with a confrontation, but with a recalculation. That's how humiliation works in reverse. They came expecting to make someone small. They left, reminded that they were. And the neighbor, an ordinary man with a cigarette and good memory, had witnessed the exact moment confidence turned into fear. He would remember it. So would they. And so would I. The mistake wasn't choosing this house. That part made sense. A quiet street, an elderly woman living alone, no visible protection, no loud relatives, no daily visitors. On paper, it was perfect. Low resistance, high compliance, minimal noise. The real mistake was assuming the house was empty of consequence. That assumption is common. People look for uniforms, cameras, lawyers, men with loud voices. If they don't see those things, they relax. They fill in the gaps with their own confidence. They don't imagine that protection can exist elsewhere. at a distance, in silence. I started piecing things together once the immediate pressure was gone. Fear sharpens the moment. Calm sharpens memory. I remembered details my mother had mentioned casually, without realizing their importance. The timing of visits, the sudden politeness, the way one man corrected another mid-sentence, small fractures in their performance. They hadn't planned to stop. They had been stopped. A few days after the neighbor's comments, I received another message. No subject line, no greeting. Clarification completed. Ownership confirmed. No further interest from involved parties. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Bureaucracy doesn't apologize. It erases. I didn't forward it to my mother. She didn't need proof anymore. The proof was the quiet. The proof was the way she started opening windows again. The way she stopped jumping at the sound of cars slowing near the house. Still, something inside me wasn't finished. Humiliation doesn't always come from direct insult. Sometimes it comes from being underestimated so thoroughly that your existence isn't even considered in the equation. That's what they'd done to me. Not targeted me, excluded me. They saw woman, service, away, and stopped thinking. That bothered me more than the threat itself. So I asked questions, not directly, not officially, just enough to understand the mechanism. It turned out to be simpler than expected. A small group working through shell companies, testing properties, applying pressure before paperwork, counting on people not knowing their rights or not having the energy to defend them. Efficiency through fear. Someone had flagged the address once a certain name entered the system, not with alarms, not with sirens, just a note that made people pause. Pause leads to research. Research leads to context. Context ruins plans. They learned very quickly that the absent owner wasn't absent in the way they'd hoped. That distance didn't mean disconnection. That service didn't mean powerlessness. It meant oversight. And oversight makes people nervous. What fascinated me most wasn't that they backed off. It was how. They didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They didn't escalate. They dissolved the company instead. Closed the door quietly and pretended it had never existed. People who rely on pressure don't like records. Records are pressure that lasts. That told me everything I needed to know about their confidence. It had never been real. It was borrowed, temporary, dependent on ignorance. Mine wasn't. One evening, my mother asked a question she hadn't dared to before. "If you hadn't called," she said, stirring soup slowly. "What would have happened?" I answered honestly. "They would have come closer," I said. "They would have entered the house eventually, not violently, officially, with papers that looked real enough to scare you into leaving." She nodded. She'd known that already. "And then?" she asked. "Then it would have been much harder to undo." That's the part people don't understand. Prevention is quiet. Correction is loud and expensive and humiliating for the wrong person. She looked at me for a long moment. "They didn't know who you were," she said. "No," I replied. "They decided it didn't matter." That was their final mistake. Because identity isn't always about rank or titles. Sometimes it's about where your silence reaches, about who answers the phone when your name appears, about how quickly a situation is reclassified from easy to inconvenient. I didn't enjoy knowing that, but I accepted it. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for someone else to make the wrong move. They made several, and by the time they realized, there was nothing left to say. The withdrawal didn't happen all at once. It happened the way pressure always retreats, unevenly, cautiously, leaving traces behind like footprints in wet ground that slowly dry and disappear. If you weren't paying attention, you might think nothing had happened at all. A week after everything went quiet, a letter arrived. Not dramatic. No courier, no registered delivery. Just a thin envelope in the mailbox, the kind people usually throw away without opening. Official looking, but intentionally boring. No logos that stood out. No names that invited questions. My mother brought it inside and placed it on the table like it might bite. "I didn't open it," she said. I nodded and did it myself. Inside was exactly what I expected and still didn't fully believe until I saw it. A formal notice stating that the previous claim regarding the property had been withdrawn due to an administrative misunderstanding. The wording was clean, emotionless, designed to close doors rather than open conversations. No mention of visits, no mention of pressure, no mention of fear, just an apology for any inconvenience caused. Inconvenience. That word again. The favorite word of people who erase harm by minimizing it. The letter stated that the company involved no longer existed, dissolved, liquidated, as if it had never been more than a typing exercise. No contact information, no signatures worth remembering. A full retreat disguised as a clerical correction. My mother read it twice, then a third time. "So that's it?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "That's it." She sat down slowly, like someone finally allowed to rest after standing too long. Her shoulders dropped, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "They won't come back?" she asked. "No," I replied. "They can't." That mattered. Not won't. Can't. Over the next few days, normality crept back in carefully, like an animal testing whether it was safe. The lights went off at night again. Curtains opened during the day. My mother started spending time in the yard without constantly looking toward the gate. The bench stayed empty. No cars slowed near the house. No unfamiliar footsteps echoed in the evenings. The street returned to its usual rhythm. Boring, predictable, forgettable. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently. Humiliation leaves residue, even when you win. It's not always anger. Sometimes it's vigilance. Sometimes it's the knowledge that safety can be negotiated behind your back if you're not paying attention. That confidence, someone else's, can intrude into your life without warning. One afternoon, while helping my mother sort old documents, I found the original paperwork from my grandfather. Yellowed edges, careful handwriting, clear intent. He'd known what he was doing. He'd anticipated a world where assumptions would be used as weapons. "He always said you shouldn't wait until you're threatened to secure what's yours," my mother said. I thought about that later. Alone. Those men hadn't targeted us because they were brave. They'd targeted us because they thought we were isolated. When isolation failed, so did they. That's the part that stays with you. A few days before I returned to base, my mother did something small but telling. She replaced the lock on the gate, not because it was broken, but because she wanted to, because she could. No fear behind it, just choice. "I should have done this years ago," she said lightly. I smiled, but inside I felt something settle. Resolution doesn't always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels quiet, heavy in a good way. On my last evening, we sat at the kitchen table with tea and nothing urgent to discuss. No strategies, no contingency plans, just weather and groceries and the neighbor's cat. Normal conversation. That was the real withdrawal. Not the letter, not the apology, not the vanished company. The withdrawal of fear from the room. When I left the next morning, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Same walls, same gate, same narrow street. But it wasn't the same house anymore. It had been tested, and it had held. The strangest part wasn't the fear. It was the silence that came after. When something threatens you for long enough, your body adapts. It learns the rhythm of danger. The evenings when footsteps might appear. The sound of a car slowing down too much. The pause before a knock. Your nervous system stretches itself around the threat and calls that shape normal. When the threat disappears, the shape remains. For the first few days after the letter, my mother kept waiting. I could see it in the way she paused before opening the gate, in how she listened an extra second before answering the phone, in how she stood still whenever an unfamiliar sound drifted from the street. Nothing came. No voices, no shadows at the fence, no men rehearsing confidence in the yard. Just silence. At first, it felt like relief. Then it felt like emptiness. And emptiness can be unsettling when you've grown used to being alert. I returned to base shortly after. The routine swallowed me again. Briefings, schedules, commands spoken without explanation. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. My mother resumed calling every evening. She didn't mention the men anymore. Not once. She talked about the weather, about the neighbor's tomatoes, about how one of the kitchen drawers kept sticking. Ordinary things. Safe things. But I noticed details she didn't comment on. The calls came earlier now. She no longer waited until late. And if I didn't answer immediately, she called again. Not frantic. Just confirming. Fear doesn't announce when it leaves. It just loosens its grip slowly, like fingers releasing after holding too tightly for too long. One night, during my shift, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't scanning for bad news anymore. Before, every vibration of my phone had carried weight. Even neutral messages felt like they might tip into urgency. Now, the phone was just a phone again, a tool, not a warning system. That absence felt unfamiliar. Silence can be loud when you don't trust it yet. A few days later, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to. Two people talking casually about property disputes, about how most people don't fight back, about how pressure works better than paperwork if you apply it early. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them. I just listened. And I realized something important. This wasn't personal. It never had been. That was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it meant we weren't singled out for weakness. Disturbing because it meant this happened often. People relied on silence, on politeness, on the belief that if something sounds official enough, it must be legitimate. They relied on women being tired, alone, unsure, and afraid of escalation. They relied on people wanting peace more than justice. That thought stayed with me. Back home, my mother began doing things she hadn't done in months. She invited a neighbor in for tea. She worked in the garden without checking the street every few minutes. One evening, she turned off all the lights before bed. She told me about it the next day, like it was nothing. I slept better, she said. I didn't tell her that I'd slept better too. Silence, I learned, isn't just the absence of noise. It's the absence of pressure. And when pressure lifts, it leaves behind questions you didn't have time to ask before. What if I hadn't answered the phone that day? What if I'd dismissed the first signs as exaggeration? What if I'd waited for something illegal to happen before acting? Those questions don't have comforting answers, but they do have lessons. Silence isn't always safety. Sometimes it's just the space before something decides whether to move forward. The difference between danger and calm often comes down to who fills that space first. That's what I understood now. My mother never said she was afraid anymore, but she didn't say she wasn't either. She simply lived, carefully at first, then more freely, as if reclaiming normality step by step. And I let the silence exist. I didn't rush to fill it with explanations or reassurances. I didn't dramatize what had happened. Some things lose their power when you don't give them a stage. Still, every now and then, when the evenings grew too quiet, I remembered the men who used to stand by the gate and speak with confidence. And I wondered whether they remembered the moment that confidence failed. Silence, after all, works both ways. I used to think names were just labels. Something you answered to. Something printed on documents. Something that mattered only when you were being called out loud. After everything that happened, I learned that names work very differently in certain spaces. Sometimes a name doesn't introduce you. It stops things. Back on base, life narrowed again into its familiar geometry. Orders, timetables, rooms where voices carried authority without volume. I slipped back into routine easily, almost too easily. That was another thing service teaches you. How to compartmentalize without appearing to do so. To anyone watching, I was unchanged. But I noticed the difference in how people paused when my name appeared on screens, how questions were phrased more carefully, how certain topics were dropped mid-sentence. No one said anything directly. They didn't have to. Recognition doesn't need ceremony. One afternoon, I was called in to clarify a minor administrative issue. Nothing related to the house, nothing dramatic. Just a routine correction. The officer handling it glanced at the file, then at me, then back at the file again. "This was already noted," he said slowly. "Yes," I replied. He hesitated. "You didn't need to get involved personally." I looked at him, calm, neutral. "It was personal," I said. That ended the conversation. What struck me later wasn't the respect. It was the restraint. People didn't congratulate me. They didn't ask for details. They didn't turn it into a story. The reaction was more subtle. Recalibration, like the neighbor had said, like the men had shown when they stepped back. Something had been corrected. A name had entered a system where it hadn't been expected. I thought about my mother then, about how she never used my name when she talked about the situation to others. She'd say, "My daughter," not because she wanted to borrow authority, but because she didn't want attention. Names draw lines. Sometimes you don't want lines drawn. Still, lines exist whether you acknowledge them or not. One evening, during a call, my mother said something that stayed with me. "They asked about you," she said casually. "Who did?" I asked. "Someone from the local office," she replied. "Just checking. They wanted to confirm you were well." That was new. Not concern, not curiosity. Confirmation. "I told them you were fine," she added. "Busy." I smiled at that. Busy was the safest version of me. After we hung up, I sat there longer than necessary, thinking about how strange power really is. It doesn't always look like force. Often, it looks like absence, like problems dissolving before they fully form, like doors never opening because someone decided, quietly, that they shouldn't. The men who came to the house had believed they were invisible operators, quiet, efficient, untouchable. They hadn't expected to be seen. And once you're seen by the wrong people, confidence becomes liability. You start choosing caution over boldness, retreat over persistence, silence over repetition. That's what my name had done. Not because it was special, but because it was connected, anchored, documented, placed within structures they preferred not to attract attention from. They hadn't been afraid of me. They'd been afraid of who would answer next. I didn't feel triumphant about that. If anything, it made me more careful. Awareness changes how you move through the world. It makes you less loud, not more, less eager to prove anything. Power that needs display is already unstable. Before sleep that night, I thought about the younger version of myself. The one who signed papers without reading too deeply. The one who believed distance meant disengagement. The one who assumed protection had to be visible to be real. She would have thought this story ended with confrontation. It didn't. It ended with a name spoken once, in the right place, and never spoken again. And with men who learned that some houses aren't empty just because no one answers the door. People expect endings to be loud. They imagine confrontation, raised voices, apologies demanded, someone exposed in public. That's the version that feels satisfying from the outside. Clean, obvious, easy to explain later. This didn't end like that. What stayed after everything was quieter and heavier. I went back to base, back to routine, back to being a function inside a system that doesn't pause for personal history. On paper, nothing in my life had changed. Same rank, same duties, same schedule carved into days that belonged to someone else. But internally, something had shifted its position and locked there. I stopped assuming safety was default, not in a paranoid way, in a precise one. I noticed who spoke confidently without proof, who avoided specifics, who relied on repetition instead of facts. I started recognizing the same pattern I'd seen in those men at the gate, confidence built on expectation rather than legitimacy. That awareness didn't make me anxious. It made me exact. My mother changed too, though she'd never describe it that way. She didn't become fearful. She became deliberate. She kept copies of documents in places she could reach quickly. She spoke less to strangers. She stopped explaining herself when no explanation was owed. One evening, she said, almost casually, "I don't feel small in my own house anymore." That sentence mattered more than anything else, because humiliation isn't just about threats. It's about shrinking someone's sense of permission, permission to exist, to belong, to refuse. They hadn't tried to take the house first. They'd tried to take certainty. They failed. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't need to. What happened to them was more effective than punishment. Their plan collapsed quietly. Their confidence dissolved. They left without a story to tell, without a win to justify the attempt. People like that fear attention more than consequences. I learned something important through all of this. Strength doesn't always look like resistance in the moment. Sometimes it looks like knowing who to call and who not to. Sometimes it looks like silence used deliberately. Sometimes it looks like letting other people reveal how much they rely on your absence. And humiliation? It loses power when you refuse to internalize it. They tried to make my mother feel temporary, replaceable, alone. Instead, they reminded me of exactly where my reach begins and where it doesn't need to end. If anyone reading this is dealing with something similar, pressure disguised as politeness, threats wrapped in paperwork, confidence used as a weapon, here's what I'll say. Don't rush to explain yourself. Don't assume silence means weakness. And don't underestimate how quickly things change when the right person becomes aware. You don't need to be loud to be protected. You don't need to be present to matter. And you don't need to prove strength for it to exist. Sometimes, all it takes is one call. And the people who thought they were untouchable quietly disappear from your evenings forever.